out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to, you have to say that's magnificent, the World Cup themed little brother of the mothership that is Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. We're stepping back in time tonight to discuss what a certain book describes as football's greatest cult team. We're talking Piontek, Laudrup, Elkjaer, Arneson, Lerby, and the rest of the Danish Dynamite of the mid-1980s, with a very special guest too. But before we get to him, my fellow impressionable youngster from 1986, Stephen Scragg is here. Welcome, Stephen.
Oh, looking forward to this, Aidan. My international team of choice. Certainly in a European capacity by, I'd say a long way, but that Lobanovsky Soviet Union from the same 1986 World Cup has a huge soft spot for me. But yeah, Denmark is very much, Piontek's Denmark's way ahead of everyone else.
Well, you are dressed for the occasion. Those who can't see on podcast form, we can see you in perfect 86 get-up. So there we go. And we are joined by one of the authors of the hugely popular and superb book, Danish Dynamite, the excellent Rob Smyth. Welcome, Rob. How are we?
I'm good, thanks. How are you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you. We're doing very well. And delighted to have you on, Rob. I think on occasion people have crazily described some of us in glowing terms, and we just laugh it off. But I think to all of us, Rob, this book that you were a big part of back a few years back is something that's really touched a nerve with us all, I think, in a very good way. It's great to have you on. Rob and I have spoken several times on Nessun Dorma pods and the like, so it's great to have you on here. A little shout out to your enterprise over there as well. Now, let's start us off in a bit of a more general way. The dedication to your book, Danish Dynamite, Rob, reads to Sepp and the boys of 86 who made football fun. I think that's a lovely little neat way. I don't know whether you wrote that or someone else. It sums things up rather nicely as to what this team meant to people, to neutral football lovers, I guess, at that time. So if we start off, let's transport ourselves back to the summer of 1986, those shimmering, dazzling images of football played in the midday Mexican sunshine beamed back to our homes. FIFA's technical report of the 86 World Cup said Denmark played the most spectacular football during the tournament. And this was obviously a World Cup with Maradona at his finest, the great French, Brazil, the USSR that Stephen talked about. None of these produced a collective that was quite so captivating as Denmark, certainly to all of our minds at least. So, Rob, what are your memories of that team at the time, I guess? What do you recall if you think back, and the impression they made on you as a youngster at that point?
Yeah, so I'd have been 10 years old, and my biggest memory is actually of the kit, which Stephen is wearing right now. That's probably the most vivid memory because my brother had it. I don't know how he got hold of it. I think my mum had to do a lot of... My brother was a bit older. He'd have been like 16. I think my mum had to do a lot of kind of ferrying around to find it. But so I feel slightly bad saying this. My memories of the team are not that vivid from the tournament. It's more through my brother's eyes and kind of seeing how excited he was. Because I was at the age where I kind of looked up to him enormously. And the two teams he absolutely adored were France and Denmark. So that's probably, I've got a vague memory of seeing the goals and, things like that. But I don't have a memory of a specific game, partly because most of the games are played late at night, I think. Certainly the two kind of big ones, Uruguay and Spain. So it was sort of the way the book came about from my side. I know that Mike and Lars, who I wrote the book with, Mike's memories are more vivid, even though he's younger than me, which is really interesting. I think he's like 3 years younger, and Lars obviously would have grown up with it. But the way it happened, because I inherited a shirt from my brother and I lost it at university and I was absolutely fuming. And I think I mentioned it as an aside in like a Guardian Live blog in 2004. And Lars happened to be night editor at the time in the office, and he came over and said hello and said, "Is that true about the shirt?" And then we got chatting, got to know him that way. And so I sort of grew to know the team more kind of secondhand. My memories are only really like snapshots, like a Laudrup's goal and maybe Elkjaer's third goal against Uruguay, but they're not actually that vivid. So in some ways, I'm a big fraud, I'm afraid to say.
Oh well, let's not call it that. I think that's quite understandable and natural for those of us. I mean, we're all of a similar age, so I was, what was I, 11 going on 12, and Stephen about the same at this point. You're right. A lot of it was late at night. Now, what I recall really quite well, and obviously I didn't see lots of them at the time, is trying to whiz through the Uruguay match on my VCR the morning before rushing off to school to try and get through all the goals. I don't recall whether I sort of watched it a bit more in depth later on or anything. Probably not, because there was more stuff going on. But that I really, really recall well. Whereas, as you're right, at that age, we weren't going to be staying up all night watching the games in full as they happened. So a lot of it was probably from highlights packages and little things like that. But even then, it stands out, doesn't it? Now, I think you're right, Rob. A lot of us have had to increase or gain our appreciation from a little distance afterwards as well, and you get to know more about it. And that's where, I don't know, when you've got that sort of rose tinted look back, then you add the depth and find out actually it was an even better story than you thought, because there's so much to it of how the rise came about and all this kind of stuff. Kind of adds to the mystique, I think, in my mind. Stephen, what about you in terms of your recollections of the time?
Yeah, I mean, I was into football quite quick because my dad was, still is to this day, massive on it. So it was just kind of like in our house, as kind of like it's the cat, the grandma that comes and stays every other weekend, and it was just part of the furniture. So it was just always on, and being the youngest of three kids and all of that, I was just kind of like surrounded by it. So I had no choice. I can remember being upset when having kind of like, sat there watching Wile E. Coyote cartoons and the Roadrunner and stuff like that, and having the TV dispossessed of because there's some football on the other side. And we didn't have a video recorder at that point in time, so it was kind of like you watched what you needed to watch when it was on. And but then, football swiftly became, rather than just part of the furniture, suddenly I got interested. I remember Justin Fashanu scoring that goal against Liverpool and being fascinated by that game in my own right. This David Fairclough hat-trick, and he had the same colour hair as I did, and the kits were magnificent, and it was all vivid. And then Justin Fashanu scores this goal, and the ball's magnificent, and Barry Davis is the commentator, and I was just hooked. From February 1980, basically. So a ludicrously young age, but I can remember watching like any football, from there on in, and we got football. It still felt like an occasion when football was on the television. But it was by no means in a point where you picked and chose what you watched like you would do now and ignore so much of it if you see fit. Then you would just watch. It was on. You'd watch it. And I can remember the England-Denmark game from Copenhagen in '82, and that being live on television, and just being, I wasn't an England fan as such because I was never told to be. My dad was part of that Scouse generation that were kind of, felt let down by the FA shift in that World Cup semi-final from Goodison to Wembley. And I think subconsciously, a lot of people had a bit of a switch off then. And international football was just something that was on occasionally. And then from my perspective, it was kind of like, well, which side has more Liverpool players in it? And it just felt a natural, thing to kind of like, support or stick up for that team on that particular day. So if Scotland had kind of like Hansen, Souness and Dalglish in it, then I'd be shouting for Scotland ahead of England, because, if they had kind of like McDermott and maybe a David Johnson in there, they were going to lose 3-2 because Scotland had 3 players and Liverpool's, and England had 2. So I can remember kind of like watching England games, but being reasonably bemused by it all, because it so much surrounded kind of like water cannons and riots through kind of like picturesque, piazzas. And I remember sitting there thinking, why? What are you doing? Even at a young age, thinking, what is this all about? And then kind of like on the pitch, it was all very kind of, I don't know, certainly away from Wembley, it seemed quite ludicrous on the pitch as well, because you had kind of, I can remember them losing to Switzerland in Basel. I can remember them losing in Oslo against Norway. And then kind of like the next one along was kind of Denmark, and you're thinking, just after the World Cup and the '82, which I had the Panini sticker album, I had all of that, and just absolutely absorbed everything about the 1982 World Cup. And then suddenly there's this game in maybe the September of '82. Bobby Robson's not long taken charge, and there's this Denmark side, and you're thinking, well, that should be an easy game by rights. But then you're thinking, well, England have lost to Norway, they've lost to Switzerland. How good are they meant to be? And then I can remember that game really, really well, and just how dangerous Denmark seemed and how ludicrous it seemed to be that England were a minute or two away from winning that match. And I can remember the feeling of the equaliser going in, thinking that's fair. I can remember feeling that's fair that goal's got in. And then from there, I remember watching the game at Wembley. It's only decided by a penalty, but Denmark are clearly the better side. And then we don't get to see Euro 84 on much of it on our television screens. So by 86, Denmark are just kind of this ethereal, vivid part of the imagination almost. Have they been as good as we were perceived to believe they were in playing England? And then here's their chance to prove it. And 86 was just this great oasis to be able to see this, because we'd been denied watching them in particular in 84. They get to the semi-finals with a penalty shootout, the 1984 European Championship final. Yet we only see them in snapshot images, a few highlights here and there. Not one live game involved Denmark on UK television screens in that summer of 1984. So by 86, they were ready to kind of just blow the mind. And
they truly did, didn't they? I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that the lack of coverage of the 84 probably added a bit to the impression that 86 made on people, I guess, because they were still an unknown quantity. Yeah, I know you talked about those England games, but they were a long time ago by that time, weren't they, in football terms? But yeah, anyway, if we delve a little bit into the background of how they rose to this peak, because it is quite an interesting story, I think. Stunning rise from amateurism and national team obscurity through to the introduction of professionalism only during the 1970s, or the late 1970s, I think, thanks to Carlsberg and their sponsorship. Lovely, good for them. They'd never even come particularly close to qualifying for a World Cup before 86. 82 had probably the first one with a real air of respectability about it. They beat Italy during that qualifying campaign, but still finished well short of qualifying. The national team had been exclusively amateur prior to 71 or 72, something around there, excluding foreign-based players. Now, at this time, well, during the 70s anyway, Denmark had a few good foreign-based players because the lack of professionalism at home meant they had to go abroad. So you've got the likes of Alan Simonsen, of course, former European Footballer of the Year. Morten Olsen, probably the most notable during that time, who spanned the era into the 80s. But anyway, initially, players like them weren't allowed to play for the national team. They were belatedly allowed foreign-based professionals into the national setup, and then finally a professional setup in Denmark, professional league, starting to produce players and all of that. When it came to this era, though, that we're talking about, I think that there's definitely something in the fact that it was still a fairly amateurish structure or setup, or at least culture. Crucial to probably bringing it all together in this particular case is the coach, Sepp Piontek, the German coach of Polish background. Chris Lepkowski will never forgive us if we don't mention that bit as well. He sadly died a couple of months ago this year. I think prior to his arrival, it seems to me that the case that the national setup was more of a fun club than a national sporting team, really. They went off to party in Copenhagen and just played a game while they were there and met up with their mates, and off they went again. Whereas Piontek seems to have found the nice balance between that and his more, I guess, hard-nosed, hard-line West German approach that he'd been schooled in. As he even said, Danes don't like the word discipline. So this could have been a real culture shock for both him and the team, and yet it worked perfectly. So I guess, Rob, any insight of how crucial it was that the players' sort of laid-back sense of enjoyment, which didn't dissipate, I guess, until probably sometime after this team had faded away, that sort of relaxed culture being ingrained, and then Piontek realising, I guess, that he should embrace some elements of that while implementing a bit of structure to it. Is that the perfect blend? Was that crucial to it all?
Yeah, definitely. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's a pretty remarkable juggling act, actually, because he came with typical kind of West German values. He'd been a very hard, some would say, downright filthy defender, whose nickname was Alemanno Bruto, which would probably translate. But he'd also, by this point, I think he was 40 when he became Denmark manager. He'd already coached, I think, 3 German club sides, and also in Haiti, where he had all kinds of escapades. He was giving his money literally like still wet while he was having an audience with Baby Doc with dictator and things like that. So he'd kind of see, but I do think it took a while. There was a lot of push and pull. So when I remember him saying when he turned up to watch the team for the first time, they were just kind of swanning around. They'd bringing home cheeses and stuff for their family before kickoff, and he couldn't believe it. So he moved them. They used to stay in a really nice place called Hotel Marina, with like seaside views, and he moved them to this concrete building for their national meetups called Aidan's Hus, which sounds pretty chilling, and I suspect it probably was. No TVs, couldn't phone home and everything. They hated it so much that they tried to get Alan Simonson, who was the best player and kind of coach's darling, to invent an illness called concrete illness, saying that his hearing had gone and he couldn't, he was getting headaches. So it was Piontek used it quite cleverly. He basically said, "You want a nice hotel? Give me results." So they started to give him results, but it wasn't an instant thing. And the more I think about it, it was a really, really delicate balance. And eventually they met kind of somewhere around halfway, to the point where probably the most kind of mischievous character, Preben Elkjaer, who used to, he would. Well, there's one story where Piontek thought he was putting on a tactics video. Elkjaer had switched it for a porno, but even Elkjaer said he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't have done that in the first 2 years. But they became best friends. Their families used to go on holiday together. And I think Piontek said something like he had a German head and a Danish heart. He ended up spending more than half his life in Denmark. So it's actually quite a touching story as well. But the interesting thing is how much it succeeded, because when you get to the exit from Mexico 86, his view, certainly, and there are a lot of different views as to why that happened, his view was that they never fully were able to shed the kind of Danish psychology, the kind of culture of amateurism, and not having that kind of hardness to win. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But yeah, I do think it's a really lovely story, because until then, as you say, they were essentially a pub team, which makes it even funnier that Carlsberg's money made them more professional. But there are also stories of him, like I think it's after they beat Italy, which was a really big result, even though they couldn't qualify by that point. They were the only team to beat Italy in the whole campaign that ended with Italy winning in 82. And that was the kind of moment when the players started. So that would be after about 18 months, maybe. The players started to realize they could actually beat the best teams in the world. But even that night, he gave them a 2 a.m. curfew, and most of them missed it. And some of them went back to the hotel, then went back out again. And there's a story of him basically pulling someone while they're on the dance floor, snogging someone. He's literally pulling them away. He wouldn't say who it was, but we had a couple of ideas. Yeah, but there was a constant kind of struggle. But eventually they found a really happy balance. But I also think he clearly was really, really tough. But he also liked to play up to it quite a lot. I remember him slamming when we met him, we had 3 hours with him, which was so brilliant, in some weird hotel. I think it was in Aarhus, but anyway, I remember him slamming his fist on the table and stuff. Not at us, I should stress, but more to make a point. But I also think he was really open-minded. I mean, tactically, he was way ahead of his time in the way they played, particularly around inverted wingers and playing a back three, like a proper back three without wing backs. And again, arguably they were too adventurous. So I think he was a bit more of a romantic than he liked to let on as well. But you're right. There is a parallel universe in which that is an absolute disaster, that relationship, because Elkjaer's first reaction when he heard about him was, "Oh no, a German," because he had played I think it was Cologne, wasn't it? And he had a terrible relationship with Hedden's Weisweiler. So yeah, I think ultimately it was whoever's idea it was, and I think it came from Per Rondved, who was Danish captain and had played under Piontek at Werder Bremen, and he recommended him. And yeah, it worked kind of perfectly, really. They were perfect for each other, and they did meet, kind of somewhere in the middle, and produce a team who were both kind of futuristic in style, but also had a kind of idealism that at a time when football was really, really cynical in every way. I think there were 6 or 7 European Cup finals in a row were 1-0. Obviously, we know what happened in 82 at the World Cup with Battiston and the disgrace of Hihon and everything else. And they just had this kind of really kind of idealistic, almost Corinthian spirit about them. But the way they played was definitely from the future. Like, it is the speed of their play is fascinating. You watch, we'll probably get to it, but the USSR game is when it's a World Cup qualifier in '85. It's quite dizzying to watch now, 40 years on, which is crazy, really, because most football does look relatively pedestrian, most old football, which is just the nature of evolution. But yeah, they really were quite futuristic in the way they played.
No, absolutely. It's a nice way to think of the decisions that could go one way or the other, can't they? It seems like madness to bring a German into these happy-go-lucky Danes, and yet...
Just as an aside, one person who was on the shortlist was Tord Grip, who ended up being Sven-Göran Eriksson's assistant, in England, So how that would have worked, I don't know, but I think it would have been a different team, definitely.
Yeah, I wonder where the Swedish would have gone as well. Or they have a bit of a cultural difference too, don't they, in terms of outlook and laissez-faire attitudes, I think, compared to the Swedes. But anyway, but Stephen, yeah, we touched on it briefly before, of 84 being their first breakthrough, I guess. You've talked about those England games in qualifying, should have beaten them twice, as you say, and then lighten up the finals, missing out on penalties. But on that, how impressive a tournament debut, if we class it as that. They did get a Euro semi-final in the 60s, I think, but that only having got past Albania or Luxembourg or somebody like that, it wasn't. It was a bit different for a proper tournament debut, quite an impressive one. But following on from that, from our perspective, and you've alluded to it already, the fact that we hadn't seen Denmark in that tournament beyond a few highlights, did that, I assume we've mentioned it a little bit, so I guess yes is the answer. It did add to the mystique, but would we have been as dazzled by them in 86 had we known much more about them, I guess is my question. Except for world soccer readers, obviously.
Yeah, I think we probably still would have been, because we'd have had that sense of anticipation. If you look at, say, the Brazil in 1986, and for those of us who remembered 82, the buzz around being able to watch Brazil again in 86 was incredible. And we don't deem the 86 Brazilian side as being anywhere near the 82 side, but they actually played some pretty good football in that tournament. So that concept of the last time we saw that team, you would have that air of excitement waiting to see them again. So Rob mentioned France, and his brother's love of the France side. That's another one, and we'd seen them play so well in 82, play even better in 84, because, we did get to see that final. We saw extensive highlights of that semi-final against Portugal. We saw a lot of the goals being thrown onto kind of like, it just whatever we saw in highlight form tended to revolve around Platini and his kind of like glut of goals. And we were all looking forward to seeing France again in 86, and they weren't quite the same, but it didn't stop that sense of anticipation. Whereas I think if we'd have seen Denmark, more of Denmark in 84, we'd have just looked forward so much more to seeing what they were going to do in 86, and then, embracing what they did. So yeah, I do. I think if we had seen them 84, we'd have just been all the more eager. In a way, it was like, by the time we get to see them in 86, we know they're a great team. We've been told they're a great team, but we've not seen much of them. So we were eager to see them. So I think there would have been anticipation there. We would have embraced it slightly differently, but we would have embraced them all the same.
Good to hear. Good to hear. I think that's the correct answer. Yes.
Thank you very much.
The other aspect of 84 for Denmark, Rob, I think, was the first international recognition of the Danish fans, the colour, the noise, the drinking. You mentioned the players. Well, they had their curfews in Euro 84 as well, which just went on and on and on into the night as they progressed through the tournament. The fans literally drank some towns dry, which is quite some feat. And I guess with the players' love of a good time, was it the sort of perfect symbiosis between players and fans? You could almost transpose one group into the other if they'd had different levels of footballing ability. But beyond that, how different were they? So does the fan culture around this team, again, add to the overall picture of them, and by extension to how much of an impression it made on us all?
I think so, yeah. They became known as the Rolligans.
Yes.
And I think particularly in Mexico, there are lots of stories. There were people who had these specially made buses they brought over and everything, and painted and everything. And there are loads of stories of just how popular they were. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of how you hear about Scottish fans when they go abroad. They seem to be able to manage to have industrial quantities of booze, but still remain entirely kind of cheery and happy. But I do think so, because I think the human side of the team was actually quite important as well. They were really charming. You talk to anyone. I always remember, even like when we did the book interview with Martin Tyler, and he said after that game in Copenhagen, the 2-2 draw, he interviewed a couple of them, and I forget who it was. One of them said, "Oh, we're going to this nightclub if you want to come." And he just said they were just incredibly friendly, humble, but also with a little bit of a kind of, not a swagger, because that's not really a Danish thing, but they knew kind of how good they were becoming as a team. And yeah, there was definitely a little bit, again, like, I wouldn't compare them to the Netherlands team of the 70s in terms of quality. They weren't quite that good, but the same kind of thing. They were very relaxed. Most of them could talk in multiple languages, and they just made it seem like they were doing the best job in the world, which they kind of were. But often we lose sight of that because football is so taut and tense. and particularly again in the mid-'80s. I think it's really important to remember the climate of the time. Hooliganism, not just in Britain, there were obviously problems elsewhere. And then you've got Danish fans in their thousands, and there's hardly an arrest. And even I remember, which goalkeeper was it? I always get them confused. Ollie Christ, I think, who said he couldn't believe how many basically people were waiting for them when they got home from Wembley, and like how many people come off the boat and were cheering them, and he was just trying to go about his job and everything. So yeah, I do think there was that. And I suppose the other point is there was that kind of mutual warmth and gratitude that you only kind of get when it's the first time your country does something. Obviously, if you win a World Cup, then you're going to be loved forever. But when you're the first great team your country has produced, I think the relationship is slightly different then, because nobody can believe it's happening, really. And the fans are almost as kind of giddy as the players, because, it's all they kind of ever wanted.
I think it all just looked so fun that they made everything look fun. I think just like the team were having fun, made football fun, and the fans likewise. So yeah, goes together well. So moving on towards 86 then, well, we mentioned it briefly in passing just before about this qualifying match. And Denmark were in a tough group for qualifying, the Soviet Union, Switzerland, Ireland and Norway, and ended up topping that group. Probably not by as much as they deserved to in the end, because they were excellent throughout, but a few little drop points here and there. But where they didn't drop points was against the Soviet Union, both, at home. They did away. By that point, it didn't matter. The home game to them, though, was this spectacular game in June 1985 that Rob mentioned before. You're absolutely right. Everything you've said about it, Rob. It's one that Stephen talks about at length repeatedly as well. This is your go-to, isn't it, for artistic football?
Guilty.
Exactly. The movement, the passing, the audacious goals, last-gasp clearances, free-flowing end-to-end action. It's just a good reminder of how good football can be. As Laudrup said, quoted from your book, for me, this will always be the game, which is interesting given the two tournament finals either side of it that they did very, very well in, that this is the one he cites as the game to him. And I guess that's in terms of just how well they played, whether this was peak performance, I guess. And Piontek himself said what you saw from Laudrup and Elkjaer, who scored 2 apiece in this game, both getting a brace within about 3 or 4 minutes each. What you saw from Laudrup and Elkjaer against the Soviet Union really was not normal, he said. So that's quite some praise. And I guess, though, Stephen, positivity must have been overflowing from this point on, and the qualification which came a few months later. So, yeah, we've talked about, as Rob was mentioning there, being the first. So they've been the first to qualify for a Euros, first to get to a semi-final, and now they're the first to go to a World Cup. Optimism must have been bubbling over like the lagers that they were drinking.
The headiest of days. I mentioned this to you, Aidan, last year when we did that League Cup final podcast to enjoy that success.
Heady days. Yeah. What went wrong after that?
But it'll still come good again another day. It'll still come good another day. But it's always those first initial ones that, that high is unrepeatable almost. So, to be the first to enjoy those first moments, it's the first landing on the moon. Everyone else who comes beyond that, it's great, but it's never going to hit that spot that is only attainable that first time. For that Denmark side to follow 84, to beat Italy in the 82 World Cup qualifiers, to beat England, at Wembley, to qualify for Euro 84, to reach the semi-finals, to come with a penalty kick or two of reaching the final itself, and then to go to a World Cup to qualify with a sense of peril that probably shouldn't have been. They lost a couple of games that made it a little bit harder work than it necessarily needed to be. But come off the moment, it was that game in June 1985, against a team that they had a habit of losing against. So there was something massively personal. So just in a standalone fixture, that stands the test of time. It was massive. There was so much riding on it in terms of the World Cup, but just in the whole psyche of Denmark and this team that was emerging against this, all right, Lobanovsky's still to return to the national team, the Soviet Union national team at this point in time, but it's a high plateau of football hipsterdom, this one in Copenhagen. And we're talking, what, are we 9-10 days after Heysel, as well? So it's kind of like, it puts a completely different complexion on the game of football. From the depths of Brussels to the peaks of Copenhagen is such a short period of time between the two, but they are totally different landscapes. We're talking light years between them in terms of what they are and what they mean.
I'm cutting two stools on this because I totally agree on everything you both said about this game, but I kind of think it's nice to keep it as this little secret that only true hipsters know. It's like, oh, you know about 5th of June '85 Copenhagen, do you? You're a real true hipster if you know about that. Anyway, yeah, absolutely. Now, the two key players in that game obviously were the two biggest shining lights of this Danish team, then Preben Elkjaer and Michael Laudrup, in amongst a number of excellent players. But yeah, that partnership up front is what most caught the eye into becoming, well, I guess, one of Europe's most potent strike forces at the time. So Elkjaer, he'd had that spell in Germany, but I think he was developing at Locker in the early 80s in Belgium, then moved on to Italy. And Verona in 84 famously helped them to a league title. His play, I guess, was, while still skillful, a little less subtle than some of his more intricate colleagues, I guess, a bit more of an eyes down and head for goal approach, but built on superb technical abilities and balance. And he seemed to instill a bit of panic in defences whenever he was running at them, which is no bad thing. Still a bit graceful and glamorous too, but I guess a bit more relatable than Laudrup, whose skills, I guess, were a little more otherworldly and off the charts for mere mortals. He'd made his international debut 1982 as an age 18, while still playing for Brøndby in Denmark at that point. Now professional, of course, at that stage, but soon destined for bigger things in the grandest clubs of Italy and Spain, before pitching up later in life at Swansea City, but that's another story. I guess he'd become one of the finest players of his generation, like a proper world-class playmaker. But the perfect combination, Rob, the skills of one seem to complement the other perfectly. I don't know. I've no idea. You may know how they got on off the field as well as they did on the field, and how all of that was. But on the field, they were just perfect together.
Yeah, exactly. I don't actually know they got on off the field. I mean, I don't think they were like best friends, but there's certainly no suggestion he didn't get on. Yeah, the contrast was great, wasn't it? You had Laudrup, who kind of did everything in his own time, just a genius, really. There were so many clips of him. I mean, people remember his individual goals, but and obviously they're incredible. The thing I like the most about him actually is his passing. There's like some of his passing is just amazing. There's a no-look pass for Romario when he was at Barcelona. I think it's against Osasuna. It's just, I mean, it's a joke. Whereas Elkjaer was just really hard running, just a constant pain in the arse for defenders, really. Like this incredible will to win. It kind of sums him up. There were some famous goals he scored. So there's one for Verona where they beat the champions Juventus, where he scored. Are they the champions? Yeah, they are. Yeah, basically loses his boot on the left wing, and he loses his right boot, just keeps going and just scores with his bootless right foot. There are others. Famous goal against Belgium at Euro '84, where he basically just runs through people, and it happened too often to be lucky. He does it to Scotland as well in the World Cup, and he kind of had a technique where he worked out the kind of double ricochet could benefit him. But he was skillful too. Like he developed this kind of variation on the Cruyff turn, and there's one incredible piece of skill he does that against England in that 2-2 draw. It's really hard to describe. In fact, I can't. I would recommend people seek it out. I think it's when the score's 1-1, and it's like he lets the ball, he kind of nutmegs himself, and then the same movement pulls it away from a defender. So yeah, he was just utterly relentless. And I think in the mid-80s, I think he finished second and third in the Ballon d'Or in successive years. I think before the emergence of Van Basten, I think he was probably the best centre forward in the world for 2 or 3 years. And unless I'm forgetting anyone, I would say he and Laudrup were definitely the best strike partnership in international football. I'm not forgetting anyone, am I? Obviously, you've got Correca and Muller. Muller's a good player, but I wouldn't put them in that class. Do you count Maradona and Valdano? If so, they kind of win just because Maradona. But in terms of partnership and covering every base, I think they were perfect together. And the other interesting point is that briefly at Euro '84, far too briefly, they were also accompanied by Alan Simonsen, who's the only Dane to win the Ballon d'Or and another kind of waspish attacker. But he broke his leg just for half time in the first game at Euro '84. And so they never really, they only played a few games together in qualification, but that front three would have been outrageous, really. Even though Simonsen was kind of coming towards the end of his career, he was still a really, really good player. Yeah, they were the stars. But there was a lovely balance. There were also kind of plenty of blue-collar workers as well. They had so many dribblers. I think more than anything, that's the outstanding quality of that team, I think. The number of dribblers they had, and also the change of pace, which, again, was not that great back then, but they kind of had every aspect of... And Elkjaer was one of those who provided kind of power. They had a power game as well, and he was really key to that.
The dribblers is something that's quite a contrast to what we see currently in the game, isn't it? There's not enough of that at all, and it makes you look back fondly.
Yeah, even the sweeper, Morten Olsen was a fantastic dribbler.
Yeah.
Like, basically throughout the team, they had players who could carry the ball, like really, really quickly, and just like that's often how games would just open the pitch up with one run, really.
Oh, and there's several other key players, aren't there? The likes of Søren Lerby, Jesper Olsen, Jan Molby, who'd all been at Ajax for a spell. Frank Arneson was there, or had been there, and then moved off to Anderlecht, where Morten Olsen was. It's like we've got these hubs of Danish players in some of the bigger teams in Europe at the time. Stephen, I'm guessing Jan Molby resonates with you more than Jesper Olsen. Would that be fair?
He does indeed. And I think that's part of this as well, is that, we got Molby in 84. And he'd had a stuttering first season. There'd been, he'd been asked to replace Graham Souness, basically two totally different players, and he'd show signs of what he could do with the passing and all that type of stuff. But he did flounder a bit in that first season. But then he was magical in the double winning season of 85-86, and we're looking at him thinking it's going to be great, to watch him in this Denmark side in the 1986 World Cup, and he starts as one of the 4 games that they play. You're thinking, how good can this Denmark side be? Remember that first game against Scotland, and he's not in the starting lineup, and you're thinking, how good is this? Are these Denmark players? They're keeping a Molby out of the side, and Jesper Olsen was a Man United player, as Jan Siverback had been as well, and obviously the partisan 12-year-old doesn't want them anywhere near the side, but I did like Jesper Olsen. I had a grudging respect for Jesper.
You can't not like Jesper Olsen.
He was such a fine player. And then once you've caught a glimpse of that penalty he does with Cruyff for Ajax, you soon soften over the Jesper Olsen question.
Quite right. Well, Rob, in terms, you mentioned speaking to a few of them in the work on the book. How was that in terms of speaking to lots of them? What I think I mean really is meeting your heroes. Were they everything you hoped and more, or was it in some cases a bit more begrudging and pulling teeth?
No, they were great. I checked my memory actually with Mike and Lars today just to make sure that I hadn't kind of romanticised it. There was one player, like a relatively minor player who I won't name, and I actually forget the details. I managed to piss him off somehow. I forget how it was. It was only over email, but most of them were genuinely lovely. And I was I did Laudrup on my own because it was when he was at Swansea, and I was really nervous that day. But he was fine as well, and really, really good. I mean, probably the one who sums up the most, I think, is Ivan Nielsen, who was a big, tall centre-back, like 6'4", but really quick. Won the European Cup with PSV Eindhoven, was like seriously good, probably the best. In fact, he was Denmark's best defender if you count Morten Olsen as his main strengths as sweeper or attacking. And he basically, when he finished playing, just became a plumber. And when we interviewed him, he basically had, it was a Friday afternoon, he'd done his week's work, he had a fag on, we were all sat on upturned black plastic buckets. I'm thinking this guy used to be one of the best defenders in Europe. Yeah, they were just really, really... And I know it's a cliche about Danes being humble, but they just were. They were just so lovely, so accommodating. Yeah, really enthusiastic. There were some funny things as well. We interviewed Ollie Chris. I'm sorry if I got the wrong goalkeeper. I think it was Ollie Chris, who works as a policeman, and he actually took us into one of the interview rooms, which was quite funny at the police station. It was just on his lunch break. Yeah, I was really pleased to talk to Elkjaer. That was only on the phone, but he was the one who I was probably most fascinated by. I don't want to make it sound like everyone. I mean, you guys have both got experience with interviewing people as well, but I don't know. It just felt different. It just felt genuinely quite, and also they were quite interested in why on earth a British publisher was doing a book on them, which would have been like almost 30 years after the event. I remember I had to interview Simonsen from Wetherspoons at London Victoria Station at 9 a.m. because I was on the way to a cricket match. It was the only time I could talk to him. So I had to kind of try and find a quiet corner and put headphones in. That was a bit embarrassing, but it was fine. Yeah, I was talking to Mike and Lars again. We just have such fond memories of the whole experience. The first time we went over to do interviews, the book was actually cancelled while we were over there. So we ended up getting absolutely hammered. It was on a Wednesday night. And then we thought we'll do the interviews anyway because we're going to do this sometime. We'd arranged to interview Klaus Berggren, who was kind of the box-to-box midfielder the next day, who now runs a fashion company. So we all went in that absolutely honking on Thursday morning. It was terrible. But just that, he was so full of kind of personality and stories about his time in Italy. He played for Pisa and Roma, and it just kind of all cheered us up. And then obviously it all turned out fine with the book. Probably the favourite memory is Piontek, just because we got 3 hours with him, which kind of seems surreal now to think when you think how significant the figure he is, not just in Danish football history, but also Turkish football, which is obviously really prominent now. So just nothing but fond memories really of the whole process, but particularly meeting them. There was only one, and to be honest, it was a really small thing, and I'm pretty sure it was my fault because I mixed up a time or something, and it gave me a bollocking. But it was I wish all interviews were that much fun and that kind of smooth and easy.
Well, while we're on the process, then, how did you divvy up the writing? Was it all mapped out in advance, or was it just I'm going to do that bit?
I think get lost. It's quite a while ago. I'm pretty sure we broke it down into sort of mini sections, and then we didn't do it so one person would do the whole first 6 chapters. We tried to kind of get a split. Probably the thing that made me happiest actually is when Chris Freddy, whose World Cup history I absolutely love, but he said that when he read it, he couldn't tell who had written which chapters, and that made me really, really happy because it's quite a hard thing to do. And to be honest, it wasn't like a conscious thing. What we did was, so we all wrote drafts, and then we had a time, like a brilliant week in, I think it was April 2013, where we just sat around with like pages and pages, going over literally every page and just amending it slightly. And so I'm not entirely certain which ones I wrote. I was scanning bits today just to refresh my memory. And the only thing I know is because I'm a miserable prick, I wrote the 5-1 Spain chapter, and I was really keen to write that, which probably says a lot about my psychological makeup. But apart from that, I don't actually know. So we just did the same number of chapters each, but kind of across the book, so that it didn't end. So we partly said we all got, for example, we all wanted to make sure each person got at least 1 chapter at Mexico 86 and so on. But I can't actually remember beyond that.
No, brilliant. Well, let's move on to
which says a lot about Mike and Lars' temperament. Actually, they were very tolerant of my occasional editorializing.
Oh, fantastic! Well, let's move on to 1986 then, shall we? So, a lack of World Cup pedigree, I guess, landed Denmark in the bottom group of seeds for the tournament, and therefore into the group of death, which was turned by the Uruguayan coach, at least so the story goes about this particular group. And it went rather swimmingly too for Denmark, didn't it? Victory over Scotland to kick things off before that remarkable win over Uruguay. At this point, Stephen, then before they faced West Germany in the final group game, in the afterglow of that win over Uruguay, was the world now waking up to what some of you, me, I was still waiting to wake up to it, but some of you had realised for some time something of a marker very much laid down now with that Uruguay game. As much as they had a man sent off, but goodness me, that was just astonishing.
I think Uruguay could have had 15 on the pitch.
Yes,
that particular day. Denmark would have still. It's kind of like when a team's in the sweet spot and a set of players have just got it on them, then they are going to do great things, and that was that day for Denmark. And for all intents and purposes, they look potential World Cup winners as they walked from that pitch. That day they were magnificent. I mean, going back to the Laudrup and Elkjaer as a partnership, as the differences between them. Elkjaer being the classic maverick in so many respects, and Laudrup being the textbook kind of almost the test tube football baby in some respects. Capable of so much, and the teams he played for, and even having a couple of years on loan at Lazio, is quite the thing to have on your CV. Juventus, Barcelona, Real Madrid. It just speaks of kind of like a preordained, almost script written, career. Yet there's Elkjaer, who kind of like has his problems with discipline with Weisweiler at Cologne. Shows some promise, but he's jettisoned, or he agitates for a move away, and he has this great kind of like lost years in Belgium almost, not even playing for one of the preeminent sides, and then this wonderful Indian summer with Verona to be a Serie A champion with Verona is unreal, and you could see the differences in how they were, yet what they brought together. and so much that was behind them, because it wasn't all about them, but they were just the apex of this great side, this great collective, of these players who just seemed to kind of like stride around the pitch and be able to the pinpoint passes, the speed when it was needed, the dropping of tempo when it was required. They just seemed to have all the right answers, and as they walk from that pitch after taking apart Uruguay, you are thinking this is certainly, in respects to being the closest a European side will come to this World Cup, would be Denmark.
Well, absolutely. And they then went on and beat West Germany in the final group game. I think some elements of hindsight may suggest falsely that an easier path could have been earned by losing that game, but that certainly wasn't known at that time, that Morocco would have been awaiting the runner-up of this group, because England and Morocco's group didn't finish until later. And that's who West Germany ultimately ended up facing, whereas Denmark had a slightly tougher task. But the thoughts were all on keeping the momentum going, keeping winning. The utter belief that I think was in Molby mentioned of, we believed that we could beat anybody. And so they went out and beat West Germany, but at some cost to them in terms of Frank Arneson getting a suspension. Rush of blood to the head, but a lot of personal issues, I think, going on at the time, which, it's easy to forget that these are real people that are going out there when you question how and why certain things happen. Certain flashpoints, but Arneson lost his head a bit at the end of the game, lashed out at Mateus, I think, and got himself sent off and suspended for the last 16, which, yes, well, hindsight may suggest that wasn't helpful to Denmark in any way. So let's get on to that last 16. Rob, you wrote the chapter on it quite literally. So it's against Spain, their nemesis from the 84 semi-final. They'd be a nemesis this day, there'd be a nemesis in the future as well. I think 1988 in the Euros and 1993 in World Cup qualifying. At this point, Denmark were the tournament's top scorers. They joined Brazil as the only team with a 100% record in the group stage. They'd done it with all this stunning swagger that we talked about. They were utterly confident no matter who they were facing. They simply believed they were better than the opposition, regardless of reputation. So, Rob, what could possibly go wrong?
Where do you want to start? Well, I think they do still believe they were better than Spain, even though Spain were going to win 5-1. And I think they probably got a point. I mean, just to kind of frame how the game was seen, Denmark was 6-4 on, Spain was 7-2. So Spain were huge outsiders. Spain had done okay in their group, beating Northern Ireland and Algeria. But for whatever reason, Spain weren't scared of Denmark. Butch O'Grady said before the game, Denmark play very well, but they let you play, which looked more and more of a kind of prescient comment as the game went on. Denmark started pretty well, got a sort of iffy penalty when Berggren kind of showed what he'd learned in Serie A and kind of accepted a clumsy challenge. Olsen strolls up and scores like the most languorous penalty you'd ever see. And then, people probably know the story. In the stroke of half-time, a kind of bizarre and terrible back pass from Olsen gives Butch O'Grady an open goal. And that's seen as the moment where the whole game turned and it became, it went into Danish vernacular. A rig-tig Jesper Olsen, a real Jesper Olsen is basically if you make if you cock up in public or whatever. I don't know what you two think about the game, but I obviously symbolically that is the moment, especially when you go to lose 5-1. But actually, Denmark started the second half really well. And I think it's more complicated and there are quite a few reasons as to why it went wrong. So Elkjaer had 2 chances, and then Butch O'Grady heads in from a corner. Weird defending, like half of them are running the wrong way. I don't know why. And then they just get picked off like mercilessly on the counter attack. Partly because they overcommit quite early, an approach that served them well in the past. Partly because Spain were really good, and Butch O'Grady scored 4. There was a nice quote from Soren Busk, who was one of the centre halves. Don't forget, it was a midday game. 2 of the defenders, Busk would have been 33, Olsen would have been 38. There were only 3 of them left. It was pretty much, it was supposed to be 3-4-3, but it was kind of 3-2-5. And I remember Busk saying something like, all of a sudden it's bloody quick with those counters. And it was just, they were just, their brains are scrambled and it just unraveled really quickly. In a way, it kind of ties in with the whole kind of live fast, die young ethos, but I'll let you talk about it a bit and then, maybe we can go through the kind of, because every person had a different take on it. It's kind of, it's not an unsolved mystery. It's kind of an unsolvable mystery because ultimately, probably there are multiple factors in it. But
no, absolutely. I think you're actually right that
it happens.
Yeah, and the last two of Spain's goals were in the last 10 minutes or so. So it was closer in the balance than the end scoreline suggests. And I think Elkjaer quote about how, 5-1 just wasn't right. It was too much for what the game had been. Into the second half, as they started well, if Denmark had scored then and gone 2-1 up, well, I mean, this just doesn't happen. This wouldn't happen at all. They'd have probably kept the machine going and been absolutely fine. And sometimes it's just on little moments it turns. Now, Stephen, what's your recollections or thoughts on this one?
I can remember the game where you had kind of like Denmark ploughing forward, and it was that lack of an extra man in midfield. And having spoken Molby, so much earlier on, and even a Jan Bartram, someone who could have just brought that little bit of discipline, where it was needed. But within that, there's that sense of discipline that tends to go missing sometimes. Amid genius, certainly, but as Rob said, it was never a 5-1 as Elkjaer said, never a 5-1. There was a point in that game where every time Spain went forward, they scored or came close to scoring, and every time Denmark went forward, they came close to scoring but didn't score. It's the most balanced 5-1 defeat I think I've ever seen in my life.
Which just makes it more painful, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely it does. Absolutely
you can accept a beating if you're outclassed, I think, can't you? But it's really tough to get eliminated in this way or in any way when you still feel probably to this day that you're superior.
And you've got to take into account that it was right in the sweet spot for Butragueño that day. To score 4 goals in any game in a World Cup finals is incredible going, but to be able to score 4 goals in a game against Denmark at that caliber, that particular Denmark, was unreal. He just looked, like a one of the best strikers in the world on that day. So much contrived, against Denmark, both in terms of being self-inflicted and just fate working against them. And it landed in the sweet spot for Spain. As Rob said, it's a multifaceted thing on that 5-1 defeat in the 1986 World Cup for Denmark.
Yes, a disappointment. But anyway, what it does leave us with, though, I guess, is the bittersweet memories of it all. And Jesper Olsen, as much as that moment didn't finish the game, that didn't cause the 5-1 defeat. It was only very late on they were pushing on and got totally caught. It was more in the balance, so it wasn't quite the end of it all when Olsen made that mistake. But what it does do, I think, is cause him to bookend the whole era perfectly, which is that's probably not the kind of symbolism he wants. But if you imagine, the era began with Olsen and his superb performance against England in the home qualifier for '84. He gets the last-minute equaliser that Stephen mentioned earlier in that game. We've got 4 years' worth of superb football, and then it comes crashing down off the back of, not entirely because of his error in this game. And he also scored for Denmark, of course, in this game, as you mentioned, with his nicely nonchalant penalty. It's rather unfortunate, I guess. But for Denmark, after this, it was never quite the same again. Within 2 years, they were at the Euro 88. It wasn't anything like this anymore. They'd certainly tipped over the precipice by that stage and then failed to qualify for the next World Cup. And okay, they end up winning a tournament only 6 years after this, but that's a different world and a different team entirely. As to bear pretty much no relation. I think it was only one player that actually... Was that Sievbeck? I think it was. He was the only one who sort of spanned those 2 eras. Laudrup could have done, but opted out. How did it fizzle out so quickly, though, Rob? I mean, it's a 4-year span of excellence, and yet it's just gone in the blink of an eye.
Well, they were quite an old team, with a few exceptions, Laudrup being the obvious one. Not necessarily in terms of age, but in terms of miles on the clock, because a lot of them started really, really young. So Arneson and Lerby went to Ajax as teenagers. This is an era, of course, when players finished a lot younger. So, and I think Piontek was aware of that. So there's the day before the Spain game, just to go back to that briefly, he kind of sensed that what he called the Danish mentality was kicking in. So he gave him a big speech along the lines of, look, we're Denmark, we're not Brazil. This is our one chance. And most of you will never play at a World Cup again. And he was right. The only one who did play at a World Cup again was Michael Laudrup, and that was 12 years later. So they were pretty old by the time. They actually don't look at it in terms of years, but they were. They all had a lot of miles on the clock. And also, in the same way, a lot of them thought they were shattered in Mexico because they had done so much altitude training. They were such a hard running side. They didn't, they could change tempo within a game, as Stephen said, but broadly, they didn't. You didn't have running stats then, but I bet theirs were off the charts to the point of naivety, in given how humid and hot it was in Mexico. So I think that took its toll as well. A couple of them got injuries. So, yeah, it kind of faded pretty quickly. They were a shadow of themselves. They only just qualified for Euro 88. They hardly scored a goal. They squeaked past Wales for the controversial goal and were beaten in all 3 games by Spain, of course, West Germany and Italy. And then, Romania pipped them to a place at 2090. We now know that was a pretty good Romanian side, but at the time it felt like, and it was the end of an era, Piontek left and the kind of new team started to emerge with kind of characters like Peter Schmeichel, who had played at Euro 88 but didn't really become the number one until later. Brian Laudrup and obviously Michael Laudrup would come back. But I think Piontek was acutely aware. And it's interesting. Like, when we spoke to Laudrup, he was still at Swansea, and they had not long since won. It wasn't long since they won the League Cup when they hammered Bradford, and he said he gave a really similar speech. He kind of remembered Piontek's speech before the Spain game. Basically, we are Swansea. This is not going to happen very often, and it turned out slightly better for them. They won 5-0, I think. But I think they were just a pretty old team, really. Laudrup was the exception, but most of them were. Bertelsen would have been 34 in Mexico, I think, who was a really key player, the kind of water carrier. So, I think it was just that, really. I think we have to remember kind of the players just didn't go on as long in those days. Fitness wasn't as good and, nutrition, science and all of that.
A shame nonetheless. But in an alternative universe then, Rob, where should they have reached in 1986?
Well, talking about alternative universes, they were on course to play the USSR in the quarterfinals, which would have been incredible. Now, of course, by this time they played Spain, we knew that wouldn't happen because USSR had somehow contrived to lose 4-3 to Belgium. So I think the semi-finals, don't worry about my opinion. I checked what Michael Laudrup had said because he kind of sums it up when I asked him could they have won it, and he said no. Winning this is the World Cup in '86. Winning competitions is not only about quality; it's about experience. There's a reason the big teams always go into the quarter and semi-finals. We had the quality to go far. I think we have more quality than Spain and Belgium, but we would have played Maradona in the semi-final and we would have lost him like everybody did. And I love that he says Maradona, not Argentina. And I know it wasn't a one-man team, but I would argue that the Euro 84 was their chance. They would have had to play France in the final, and they would have been very tired. But France were nervous, as we saw. France struggled to beat Spain. Denmark had already played them twice, once in the opening game of the tournament, and they had hammered them, I think, 3-1 in a friendly the previous year. So I think that was, if there was one that got away, it was Euro 84, because they should have beaten Spain then. They had the better of a really good game, actually, another really open game. And Elkjaer, who was normally totally reliable from the penalty spot, missed the decisive penalty. So I do think with the way the draw opened up, Laudrup says it perfectly, really. We would have lost to Maradona like everybody did. I suppose you can wonder about had they gone into the other half of the draw and conveniently lost the game to West Germany, which was never going to happen, by the way. But, had they? Because that was a pretty open game. Denmark played really well, but also West Germany had plenty of good moments. I remember Bremer twanging the bar from about 30 yards. So if they do that, they would have played a good Morocco side, but beatable. And then Mexico, the hosts, in the quarters. And then it would have been France in the semis. But ultimately, all roads lead to Maradona. So I don't think they were quite good enough to win it, partly because they were still, despite all the advances they made under Piontek, they did still have a certain naivety about them. But also, he did as well. So it's worth mentioning, a key point of that Spain game is Butragueño makes it 2-1 after 56 minutes. After 60 minutes, he takes off a defender, Henrik Andersen, and brings on an attacker, John Eriksson. That's when they're really exposed. The context for that is he had done exactly the same against Belgium at Euro 84 when they were 2-1 get down in a group game they had to draw to go through, and Eriksson equalised almost immediately. So you can understand why he did it. But on this particular day, and particularly in the heat of wherever it was, it just exposed them a bit too early. In hindsight, they could have maybe held off a bit more because they weren't playing badly at all. But anyway, all these things kind of come together and they end up getting completely spanked. But I kind of like the fact that I think they might be the only team to win and lose while scoring at least 5 at a World Cup. If other teams have done it, not many. I kind of quite like that as a legacy for what they stood for, really.
Definitely a bit of boom and bust about them.
Yeah, exactly.
In '86, wasn't there? Well, Stephen has had to leave us. He's had to exit the scene just like Denmark in the last 16, just to rapidly disappear when people thought he might be around longer. But I know what his thoughts are on this because he wrote them at the end of his 1986 World Cup book, where the final sentence is, Denmark should have won. But there you go. Anyway.
One thing I would love to know, by the way, is what they would have done with Maradona, because in '84, Carlsberg would have done a really good man marking job on Platini. Now, Platini had scored
in the opening game, absolutely.
Yeah, Platini had scored, albeit with a deflection, but that would have been really interesting to see how they would have tried to play that. But we'll never know.
They'd have had to clip their own wings a little bit, I guess, wouldn't they? Which is exactly what they did in that France game in '84. They were a bit more pragmatic. They were just trying to see it out with bigger tests to come where they cut loose. And maybe it would have been exactly the same.
It's a good point. That's probably the only game at those two major tournaments where they were actually slightly cautious. Partly because it was France who were the hosts and the best team. Partly because I guess it was their first game at a major tournament apart from Euro '64, which, as you said, kind of doesn't count. But after that, they kind of just, it was... I mean, their approach is fascinating. They did vary between a back three and a back four, but when they played 3-5-2, there were no wing backs. It was 3-5-2, and the wide players would be Arneson and Jesper Olsen, like genuine wingers. They were so attacking. It's really, really interesting. But also, Olsen would be on the right, a left footer, Arneson a right footer on the left, which again is commonplace now, but in those days, it just didn't happen. They really were ahead of their time tactically, I think.
And you alluded earlier of the sort of comparisons to the 70s Dutch, maybe technically superior, but obviously this was a fast-forwarded version of it. But there's similarities, I guess, in terms of how they're regarded by those who witnessed them. So for us as youths of the 80s, these were the perfect time and place for us. And I guess the 70s gang felt exactly the same about the Dutch team. Those that were sort of romanticised the team that despite not winning. Brazil of 82 probably falls into that category as well. So Denmark were almost next step in a line of big teams that just captured the imagination on the international stage regardless of the outcome overall. Laudrup himself described Denmark as Europe's answer to Brazil at one point, and that's in terms of how they played, of course. And you, Rob, once upon a time described them as like fast-forwarded version of the Holland 74 side with jet-heeled dribblers, which is a lovely quote. I like that one. I think after 86, though, football turned a little more pragmatic, didn't it? From that point on, that was the sort of last dying of the light of... we had Tele Santana at Brazil and obviously Maradona doing his individual things, and it all became a bit more structured and rigid and less risky, I suppose, from that point onwards, certainly in international and World Cup terms. Beauty, I guess, sacrificed on the altar of effectiveness, and that completely impacts how we feel about these teams. We mentioned the 1992 Danish team that won the European Championship. My view, obviously, is I wouldn't hold them in as high regard as this Danish team. I don't know whether you got any feeling for what the Danish view on that might be.
I was told once that if I didn't manage to get hold of Peter Schmeichel for this book, but I was told that if I did, that it would be wise to not offer the view that the 86 team were better than the 92 team. But it's the eternal debate, isn't it? Entertainment versus winning. I think there is a reason why so many of the most fondly remembered World Cup teams didn't actually win it. Hungary 54 will be another one, obviously. I don't know if the prevailing view in Denmark, that's really hard to say, isn't it? Because success is still ultimately so persuasive. And there was even though the 92 team were very counter-attacking out of necessity, there was still an incredible charm to the whole story because of them not being in the tournament, because of the kind of, again, the humanity and stories like Kim Vilfort's daughter was really ill and he scores in the final. He'd been flying back and forth. So, yeah, it's really hard to say. I think it ultimately is kind of personal preference, isn't it? I might be misremembering, but I don't think there's a stronger feeling one way or another as there seems to be in, say, Brazil. If you were to compare 82 versus 94, I get the impression 82 would be a lot more popular. The team who didn't win it but played probably potentially the best attacking football ever, maybe apart from 1970, whereas 94 were much more pragmatic. With one genius.
I guess they've got the fact that they won it so many that they can discount a World Cup win easily if it's not quite the right way. Whereas Denmark, well, they've won one trophy and it was a magnificent story, even if it wasn't quite the same beauty. So you're going to cling on to that, of course, aren't you?
I suppose what's also interesting is that it's only 6 years apart. As you said, it seems really weird that team fell apart so quickly. So the only person you've got is Sieberbæk. And obviously Michael Laudrup had pulled out at that point. Rickard Moller-Nielsen, who was the coach in 92, had been Piontek's assistant, but played a completely different style. Yeah, I don't know really. I just find the contrast fascinating, and so much of it is down to personal preference. I was thinking about this in reference to what's happening with Senegal and Morocco. Like, whatever happens, however that falls down, Morocco will never. Life should be about experiences, right? Human experiences. Morocco will never have a moment where they actually scored the winning goal in an African final. History may say they're the winners. Senegal will always experience that, and I do think ultimately it's really hard to quantify or kind of put a price on how watching that Danish team made people feel at the time. People of all ages, really. Because I know what you mean. Football did become more cynical. I think it was still pretty cynical in '86. I feel like there were a few kind of brave teams raging against the prevailing wind. So France will be another one. But against that, you've got obviously Uruguay, who were called the scum of world football. West Germany kind of did their usual thing, getting to the final. So I do think in that context, Denmark were just such a breath of fresh air, really. And I think that's really, really important. Ultimately, you can't kind of, the fact they didn't win, obviously it matters, but I don't think it really matters that much.
No, I quite agree. I think there's the charm of flawed genius, I think, isn't there, that it appeals. And why do we have all these discussions about the greatest teams to never win the World Cup? We don't really have the same discussion about the greatest teams to win the World Cup in quite the same way. It doesn't stir the soul in quite the same way as sort of unfulfilled greatness, or as what we perceive as unfulfilled greatness. It captures you a little bit more, doesn't it? And Denmark, obviously, in this era, fit into that bracket. Now, I think we love them more for being flawed. The fact that they didn't lift a trophy doesn't matter for how they're regarded, in the same way that the Dutch of '74 and you can talk Hungary in the '50s or Brazil '82. These teams that are always in the conversation as the greatest to never win. We love them so much in spite of whether they didn't win. In fact, probably we love them more because they didn't win. And Cruyff himself said as much, didn't he? People remember us more. So maybe we won after all. Well, he might be stretching things a little bit there, but you certainly get his point. There's I'll have to read this. A lovely quote in your book. Don't know which of you wrote this, but the fact that their story had a bittersweet tang and a doomed innocence only accentuates their alternative appeal. The best stories in life are the ones where those involved don't get the girl, the happy ending, or even the Jules Rimet trophy. I think that's wonderfully put. You should take credit for that one, Rob, even if you can't remember if you wrote it. Well, very good. Well, the final thing I think to talk about is their kit too, because that is something else that has lived through the age. It was copied. Southampton and Aston Villa both had kits of this kind. Coventry, yes, that's right, they did. Yes. Personally, I love the '84 one just about as much. I thought that was a really nice kit as well. But it's the '86 one that's gone down in folklore, I guess. I think is a time of pretty cool kits as well. They were all quite shiny in this era with, we'd just emerged from the fairly stoic days of the '70s and all this exciting kit and people experimenting with. We get very cool international kits at this time. The Dutch of '88 is one that you either loved or hated, but it certainly lived on. France in '84 was another gorgeous kit. I have a theory, Rob. Now, Stephen's heard this many times before. I have a theory on international tournaments and international teams that the better your kit, the better your chances. It just seems to work out that way. Those with the great kits do well. In this regard, I'm classing them as doing well because of all the great memories they gave people. I think a fabulous kit enhances the story. I relate this to England sometimes. When they have a terrible kit, they do really, really badly. Euro 2016 is my go-to example on that one. So I'm always interested to see the kits teams are bringing out, and it fits perfectly for this Danish team. I think it's a kit that is loved as much as the team, or probably the two go hand in hand, I suppose, don't they?
Yeah, and I suppose also, and I do agree with you, but also I guess there's also an element, and I don't think it applies to this kit, but there's also an element of the kit becomes great because of the memories that the team provide you while wearing it. But yeah, I suppose the interesting thing about
you're saying my theory proves itself. That's amazing. It causes itself.
The interesting thing about this kit is it wasn't that popular at the time. I think it was described as a carnival suit in one of the papers. The players don't like it, but like Berggren, I'm just checking it, quote, and he's the fashionista of the team. He said, what was it? He said, it was totally awful when you look at it now, but as a piece of publicity, it was fantastic. We were probably too hungover to disagree with him, but I should have done. I think it's great. It's so different. I actually prefer the white one. I no particular reason. I just really like that. I mean, they both look. What I like also is that they wore all 4 color combinations in the 4 games. So the red with the stripes and the white shorts, red with red, white with white, and white with red. I think. Yeah, it's a beautiful kit, and I do think that's the golden age of kits, sort of mid '80s to up to and including Italian 90 would be my favourite period, I think. So when people were starting to get creative, but they hadn't gone completely wild with the design.
They hadn't gone too far like the early 90s, yes.
Goalkeeping show or whatever in 94. But yeah, it became a huge thing, really. And Hummel were quite kind of forward thinking around that time, I think, particularly those striped panels. I'm just reading a quote from the designer, actually, Birgit Leitner. Sorry for mispronouncing it. It wasn't that the players contributed to the design, she said, but they were a bunch of exuberant and fun boys. Working with them can only lift your spirits. So I quite like the idea that even on some subconscious level that it's a kind of design to fit them. But yeah, I think the kit, as I said, was the thing that I remember most vividly from the time. I'm being absolutely fuming when I lost at university, but it probably is still one of my all-time favourite kits, and not just because of the association. I just love how different it was for the time. It just looked great, and we were so happy when and this was definitely Lars's idea, to have the book cover in the style of the kit, and it just worked perfectly. Which it kind of seems really obvious now, but we were actually fumbling around for ages, and then when we saw it just looked perfect. And it's so kind of instantly familiar. And also, there's a really nice video. Lars found this, I think it was after we'd done the book, of Maradona kind of messing around the day before the final in a Denmark kit. We don't know where he got the kit, because I was also, a guy from The Athletic was trying to do something on it and asked me if I knew, and we don't know, but it's quite nice that even Maradona kind of liked the kit and wanted to wear it and somehow be associated with them. In fact, even he had an opinion on why they lost to Spain. In one of his books, he just said simply, the manager went mad, which I think refers to the substitution of Eriksson for Anderson. But I guess it shows that even Maradona, they were all kind of on his radar, to the point where the day before World Cup finally just sitting around in a Denmark home kit. I like that. I'd love to know the full story and where he got it. But
yeah, that's magnificent. Yeah.
Well,
they made it to the very end of the tournament one way or another. Then,
exactly. Yeah, they did meet Maradona, kind of. What's your all-time favourite World Cup kit?
Oh goodness me! Now there's a question.
I still have a soft spot for England '82, even though it's kind of before my time, and '90 as well. I really like Colombia.
I think when it comes to
90, for no particular reason.
I love a Colombia kit. I think there's obviously it's got different connotations, and I guess historically, but from what happened, their '94 kit I really liked as well. It was just so vivid and bright. I think Brazil have fluctuated between quite nice and they've messed it up a little bit at times. I preferred the simplicity of the round collar that they had in '82, like they had in '70. I think in '82 they went slightly paler shorts, and that just seemed to be sun faded, which kind of fitted the theme for me as well. So that's a glorious one. I guess something topical for this summer. I like when USA last hosted, the kits they came up with then were very different.
The one with the quite hangover baiting lines.
Yeah, the wavy red and white stripes, and then the other one, the sort of denim look stars. I think that was
quite interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think is exactly the way to term it, but it was quite different and brave.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
I quite like that. Yeah,
anything that's different is. Yeah, I love Topper era Brazil, which I think was '86 and '90. I don't know why. It's just something about a slightly different manufacturer logo, obviously coupled with that kind of beautiful sheen that you get on a Brazil kit. Yeah.
And England, I think if we're going closer to home, I think some of their later ones have been a bit bland. The one they've just released now, it just looks like a white T-shirt with a logo on.
I can't picture most of them, the modern ones. Probably from I could probably picture up to and including 2006, although that might just be a natural process of aging. But yeah, I feel like '82 and '90 are the really memorable ones in my lifetime.
I like the 2006 England change kit. I think that deep red.
Okay, yeah,
particularly nice. But yeah, it probably hasn't been quite the same since, and that's why they haven't won, Rob. That is why. Anyway, okay, let's end things there. Then we'll exit with the good grace, just like Jesper Olsen and gang back in Querétaro, Mexico in June 1986. Well, thank you very much, Rob, for all your contributions. It's been absolutely fantastic getting you on. I'm sure we'll speak again soon, but many thanks for joining us on this one, Rob. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Can I leave the last word to Ivan Nielsen on how he got over the Spain game? He
Go
said,
for it.
He basically said I was drunk for 6 days. So
that's the only way to do it, and that will have handily got him through the next round of games too, won't it?
Thanks very much.
Thank you spot on, and thanks to Stephen too in his absence. But thank you everyone for listening. Do give us a follow, subscribe, and all of that wherever you get your podcasts, and join us again on Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. Whether it's on the World Cup themed pods or any of the others, we'll be back with more soon, I am sure. So thank you and bye.